Okay, I think this will be the last video for this little series on security. And we're going to talk a little bit about granting and revoking permission. Now, this is kind of the smallest detail of giving database permission to the users. We kind of started with the big picture, right? We started at the server level, then we went down to the database level within the server, then we went down to the roles. Now we're actually going to look on how do you give people access to a certain thing, one certain thing on your server. Okay. How do you give them access to that? So let's look at, we'll just use the person table. Okay. I'm going to right click on it and say properties, and I'm going to go to permissions here. Okay. And what permissions do people have to the person.person table? And it doesn't look like they have anything, does it? I don't see any users or roles that have permission to this table at all. Well, how are people getting permissions? Well, they're probably getting it from the schema. And from the schema, we don't see anything either. Well, where are they getting permission into the schema? And that's probably from the database permission. So here's all the different things that are applied to this table all the way up at the server level. Okay. But we're not worried about that, because remember, if we give people permissions at higher levels, they can roll down into the lower levels. We're just going to look at directly doing, and I want to make sure I get back all the way out. Permission to the person table. I want to start by doing it for a user. So I right clicked on the person.person table. I'm going to go to permissions, and you need to know the commands to do this, but we're going to see that because we have that nice script button here that's going to show us the commands. And there's really only a couple commands when it comes to, you've seen the commands to create roles. Okay. There's really only a couple commands to give people permissions to do things. Okay. And that's grant, to grant somebody permission to something, and revoke, to take something away. It's that easy. All right, so let's add a user that we want to give permission to our person.person table. So I can go search here, and let's do Sally, because we've been using Sally. I'll hit check names. There she is. It found her. Okay, so Sally, what permissions do we want to give her on this table? Okay, I want to give her permission to, do I want her to alter this table? Do I want her to be able to insert data? Alter the table structure would be way different than actually being able to insert and change some data, right? Okay. So we have to be careful about what we do. We want her to be able to run a select statement on this table. Maybe that's all we want her to do. And I can click the grant button there. She's allowed to do a select on this table. That's what Sally can. Now we already know Sally's got more permission than that, because I think we made a data reader and writer already for the whole database. But let's see what this command does. I'm going to grant Sally select permissions on the person.person table. Okay, I'm going to go up here and hit script. And here it is. Grant, and it's really that simple. Grant, what do we want to give her? I want to give her select permissions on this table to this user. Right? So when I run this, Sally would be able to run a query on that table. That's it. Let's go back into our thing here, because I never ran that yet. Let's give her permission to select. Let's also give her permission to update and insert data into that table. Okay. And then let's look at some of these other options here. Okay. What if I give her insert and then I click this button that says with grant? Actually, I'm going to do that on select. I'm going to hit with grant. Let's go look at the script that's generated when I give Sally permissions to select, insert, and update on this table. But on select, I'm giving her with grant. Let's look at the commands. Okay. And here's the command. we granted select on person to person to Sally. And notice it says with grant option. Okay. What does grant option mean? That means Sally is allowed to give somebody else that permission if she wants to. So Sally, now that she's got permission to select it, since we have this on there, she can also give somebody else permission to select from this table. So Sally can grant it to George. And if George is given it with grant option, that means he can give it to Sammy. Okay, so now they pass these permissions down. The big question is, if Sally gives it to George and George gives it to Sammy, what happens if I take it away from Sally? Okay, and if that happens, everybody down the chain that was given it because of this grant option, they'll lose their access. So you need to know what grant option is. That means you're giving permission to somebody. Like, here, I'm giving you the key to my house, and if you want to, go ahead and make copies and give them to your friends. All right. Sometimes that's necessary in a large organization where there's a lot to do. We can't do it all ourselves. So some people underneath you may need permission to take care of that for you. So you give them grant options. Okay. We also grant insert on person to Sally. Okay. Now, this go and use, all these go and use, I have or haven't talked about. When we write a script, we have to have goes and use in here. But if we were doing this, we'd run this command, and then we'd run this command ourselves. Then we'd run this command that gives her the update permission on person to Sally. Okay, so those three permissions take three statements, right? And we already talked about the efficiency of roles. If I had to do that for Sally, and I have to do it for George, and I have to do it for Sammy, it starts adding up a lot. So it's better to make that role and give permissions to the role and then assign people to the role instead. Let's go back and look at that. Back here, I can grant all these permissions to Sally, or can I take her out? Go back to search. Let's do, didn't we make a sales associate role? That's the role we made, right? Okay. Or instead of just doing it to Sally, we can say anybody who's a sales associate needs select permissions, insert permission, and delete permission. And remember, back on the role, we can add Sally to sales associate. Let's go to the script here. Okay. So now we granted delete permission to the sales associate, we granted insert permission to sales associate, and we granted select to sales associate. And anybody who's in that role, remember back on the role screen, we could add users to it, they would automatically get permission. So we use the roles for management. Okay, so know the basic format of those commands. Grant, and then what thing are you trying to grant or to allow or disallow? Grant alter, grant control, grant delete, grant insert, grant references, grant select, grant take ownership, grant update. Once somebody takes the ownership, they can do anything they want to it. So if they have that permission, they can take ownership of an object and do whatever they want. They want to be able to update whatever they are. It's always grant or revoke. Let me see if I can get a revoke statement to work here too. I'm going to give Sally, let's give her select permission. Okay. Here's our script again. Gives all those, plus it gives Sally select. Let's go ahead and execute that. Okay. All right. And now we open properties, permissions. We can see that they're there. What if I want to get rid of Sally's select permission now? Okay. And I need to revoke select. So I'm going to take that out and I'm going to hit script so we can see this. And you can see that the only change we made is I took Sally's permission away. So it used the revoke. So we're going to revoke select permission on the person.person table to Sally as DBO. I'm the DBO. I'm the database administrator. So we took away Sally's permission as direct access to that DBO. Now, if she still has access from the role, she's still okay. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and execute this. Excuse me, I was highlighted again. Okay. Go back into our properties, and we can see Sally doesn't have any permissions anymore. Okay, it took her permissions away. She'll still have them because she's a sales associate. She'll still have those permissions. I granted that as the database, the DBO, the database administrator. That's the role I'm in. So she had those. So anybody that ever gets permissions, we can tell who gave it to them by looking in here as well. So grant and revoke, they're the foundation of permissions. Roles are a good way to manage permissions to individual objects. Servers have built-in roles, but we can custom make our own roles. That's the basics of security. Okay? Usually as an entry-level database administrator, you're not going, somebody above you is probably dealing with the security until you get a good handle on it. But the basics you need to know is how to give, how to get somebody to log in, how to get them a user to connect to the database, and how to give permissions to that user to database objects, or put the user in a role and give the role permission to the database objects. And that's going to be the end. There's not going to be an assignment for this video. I will put some references in the lesson plan folders for you to review those server roles and the database roles that are provided by default. Make sure you understand the grant and revoke and how to use roles. At least big picture, because that's enough to let you pass the MTA exam. All right, that's it for today. Thanks.